Chapter 2, Part 2. Okay, so obviously I've managed not to just create one mind map for the chapter, and I've managed to go for two. So with my aim of still being concise, doing the best I possibly can with that. So the second part of this chapter is also focusing on the methodology that I applied. So again, just it's fairly obvious by now, this is grounded theory methodology, but it's how it's been applied in this particular data gathering and some of the things that I had to consider about it. So looking at the research design and question, so what we've got to remember here is this practitioner inquiry. It's a very specific project, and I'm using the word project here, and it'll become obvious later on in subsequent videos, that is mandatory. There's no choice. They are told that in order to pass their NQT year, this is something that they are going to do. There's a relationship here then to the suggestion that this is going to inform their identity, as I said in the previous video by the General Teaching Council. And I was curious as to what was the actual influences in this. In order to do this, of course, using grounded theory, it's all about this procedural precision. I used a timescales diagram that can be seen in my thesis by Chan T, and that was done in 2019. And it's a very clear timescale of what you do when and what sort of crosses over into axes, because of course this is an iterative process. It's just continually going back and forth, and what Glaser and Strauss call the constant comparative method, and this is what I was doing absolutely throughout it, and it's absolutely integral to the research design of a grounded theory survey. In this one I was using a focus group, and I was using interviews and 2 rounds of interviews, and then throughout this, again, returning back, again, coming back, this iterative process, coming back to people and checking and clarifying furthermore what it was we said. And I'll say more about that in a moment. We need to talk about the recruitment and sampling of participants. Okay, so again, this coming back to people. So it was through a local authority, and I explained in an earlier video why this particular local authority. But again, I will say again, because it's worth bearing in mind that this local authority is research informed. They want to know what it is that is happening in educational research and play a part in it. They're committed to this in their self-improvement strategy, and that made it a lot easier to have when I had their absolute buy-in to be doing this. This was a particularly delineated group, which is kind of key with this, and particularly when, I'm looking to create a theory for something. So this was a delineated group, the NQTs in that year, so that particular cohort within that local authority. Obviously, the more data, the better that you can get. But again, this one was self-limiting by the number of NQTs in that year. So what I was doing is basically aiming for theoretical sufficiency. I was never going to get to theoretical saturation. There's a lot of debate in the literature about if that's ever possible. But theoretical sufficiency, having enough participants to be able to say, hey, this is the theory that's coming out for this cohort in this time in this local authority in Scotland. The focus group and the interviews were on Zoom again, time of COVID. For that, which wasn't ideal. It's not what I had wanted, not least because we're in a rural area and the internet doesn't always work so well, and particularly with regards to the focus group, ensuring that everyone's internet worked at that point in time. The interviews worked better in that way because we could be more flexible to get the data that we needed for this research, and if interviews didn't work, then I could reschedule them. So back to the focus group for a moment. So why a focus group? Well, it's effective in engineering conversation. It allow people to share a broad range of experiences with each other, because the NQTs all came from very different places. And Lambert and Louise in 2008 talked about this in in the literature, the importance of having those broad experiences of engineering the conversation. But from a very practical grounded theory point of view, it gave me the initial ideas that the themes that I had come up with, the initial prompts that actually this was the first time that maybe this is not what they're going to want to talk about, or that's not so important. And it gave me that initial impetus of what other areas I'm going to have to start to look at. Leading on to the interview, this is very common to do in grounded theory, and it really was whoever opted in, but I also targeted some from the focus group that I thought, this would be, you brought up some interesting ideas, it'd be really interesting to explore this further with you and then subsequently with others. So interviews, one of the rationales for doing interviews is it gives permission to discuss topics and issues that are usually usually avoided. And again, it's really important in this context because practitioner inquiry is very politically loaded here in Scotland. Who's going to turn around, other than me obviously, doing this thesis and say, hey, maybe we need to apply the brakes a little bit on this. But it was really important that there was that space and again that confidentiality associated with it. What Cavell says about this in 1996 is, again, interviews can help shed that light on the lived world. And again, this is absolutely key to this, that it was their lived reality of being asked to do this practitioner inquiry, where they were at this point in time in their career. The prompts I gave in both the focus group and the interviews were around the inquiry and identity. So this is where it got a little bit complicated because I needed to meet the requirements of the thesis as it's set by the university. However, the discussions, it prompted discussions, and discussions led to more discussions, and ended up just using this as a guide to help flow the conversation. As other areas emerged, always on that lookout for what we call the value statements. And again, asking for explanations and clarifications as part of the coordinator. So I'm not just passive in this process. In interviews, as we said before, grounded theory interviews, the researcher is very integral to this. So basically I stayed within the themes as a guide, so trying to find this happy medium, and again it was about this mutual exploration. It wasn't just me, again it was me and the participants together, and the participants highlighting reality as they saw it in that place and that time. So what actually then happened from that? So we had the data collection and generation. So I did it before the practitioner inquiry, the focus group and the initial interviews, and then the post-inquiry interviews, starting with the themes. Trying very, very hard not to generate the answers to the questions, and then finishing with the open questions for participants, anything else they wanted to tell me. And this gave them the power, a little bit of power over the direction of what it was, being able to tell me what was important to them. And this is what Chamazi calls the open stance, to being able to draw out the participants' perspectives on such things as definitions, events, the assumptions, the meanings they had. If you wish to look it up further, it's Chamazi in 2014. When having done those the focus group or the interviews, and 20% of the cohort took part in the focus group, these were all then transcribed and then coded. So basically the transcription, what I did is I digitally recorded the focus group and the interviews, and I talked about this in part 1 about why I did that as a result from the trial study. But basically it allowed me to listen for tone, explanations, the timings and pauses. It allowed basically what I felt allowed me to represent greater authenticity with their tones. And I did this by hand. I didn't use any software or whatever. I wanted to literally just write this out line by line, so I could also do line by line encoding, but also to be able to pay close attention to the language But also it bought me time, and time's really important in this, to reflect and to memo, because again, not least the biases, but it brought up a lot of conflict in myself and also questions that I had about this on top of my initial assumptions. And this constant comparison helped me refine the focus for future interviews, and also similar interviews, but also to have a look at who I might have to return to the field for clarification on various points. If they say something, you know, I didn't really explore that enough with them, or that's really interesting, I wonder if I put that to X, what they might have said about that. If I go back a minute again to the purpose of the recording, I'm going to give an example here of something that's similar that happened in the different interviews that I may not have picked up on if I hadn't been going back and listening to that. And that was about when I asked about identity. And there was this pause at the first interview, about what they felt their professional identity was, or if they could talk about the professional identity. And there was that pause, and really not quite sure what to think, and there was lots of humming and hawing across the participants in that first round of interviews, but not so in the second interview. So showing that something obviously had happened over the course of that year collectively with that. So moving on from the transcription and into the initial coding. So what happened then is that basically, having transcribed this line by line, the data is basically fractured and codes are given in grounded theory, and it reflects on what is being said and defined. The key with the codes here then is keeping as similar to the data as possible. Now, Chamath talks about this in 2020, just before her death, is, you're looking at codes in terms of what action, which and whose principles, what accounts, how do they change, consistencies, the counterintuitions, when is a discourse normal, natural, true, and having a look at this with your data in order to decide what codes to do. And we talk about in vivo codes, which is where you're basically using the words that they have used at that point in time to create the codes. However, these become verbatim, but there's also then garoons, which is where you're basically using the words. So I use example, improving, building, reflecting. So it's reflecting the process. The actions are better than in vivo, specific to individuals. So I decided for the most part to use these garoons to see the actions rather than just examples. From it, from particular individuals. I was worried, I suppose, a little bit that I might actually just only reflect one person's voice and then try and ascribe others to it. To be honest, I actually transcribed twice. So this is again where the tensions came in between what was grounded theory and what was the requirements of the thesis. So I also coded it again, looking at how the datas went to against the particular themes that I was exploring at that point of time, and plus anything else that was being said. And of course I was memoing throughout this. So what I did was I basically did the pre-inquiry and the focus group coded together, and then post-inquiry separate. And again, that's because, as I said earlier, the focus group was getting the initial ideas and the interviews then exploring those initial areas. And again, the process was evolving over time. And how my thinking was evolving over time, and I had to be particularly open-minded when it came to post-inquiry. They were then, again, having coded them separately, they were grouped again according to the similarity, and then obviously weeding out those initial codes that had less fragments of data, because again most of the codes had 12 to 27 bits of data assigned to them, but there was a couple that had 1 or 2, and then looking back on them and saying, well, where else? So on to looking at the categories. So these you ask questions about your categories and their properties, and looking at what these might be, but you also subcategories. So these can be sub-areas or degrees of a category that are leading to a category as a whole based on the code, your focus code, your initial coding, that might represent that data in the best possible way. So an example from my research was relationships, and the participants were talking about relationships time and time again. So of course this became a code, and a coded a focus code, and then became a category. But then as I went back through the data, what I was realising is actually it was two different types of relationships that they were actually talking about. And this is then reflected in them becoming subcategories. You know, the relationship with people, relationship to the job, for example. And, you know, this is what we would call in accounting theory terms the nascent, so just coming into existence categories, nascent categories. As you can probably hear then throughout this, what we're aiming to do is, again with this theoretical sampling, is that the method being used as grounding theory is the theoretical sampling is what makes this process an emergent one, as defined by Burke and Mills in 2015. It's the process of identifying and pursuing codes that arise, and then deciding what to do about them, is who to approach, why you're approaching them. So, for example, when I talked about earlier that inquiry had to be done, it wasn't chosen. So then what was the impact on their perception of inquiry in the future? And going back to some of the participants and asking that question, albeit, you know, in this occasion, theoretical sampling was again limited a little bit by the availability of the NQTs and the sample area. But again, this theoretical sufficiency in the idea that you're unlikely to reach saturation at any point, but having the sufficient number. And throughout this, what we're talking about is also this developing the reflexivity. So this is an active process system that is developing the insight into your work to basically gauge your future actions. And this is defined by Burke and Mills as such in 2015. It's having that reflective state and being sensitive to the variation and differences. And the main way that we do this within grounded theory or constructive grounded theory is through the memoing. And I fully admit that I really struggled what to do with the memos. So I was writing all this stuff down, but what actually to do about this. And I talked about this a bit in the trial study, that, you know, with all these memos, other people talk about cutting and pasting and moving their memos around, but that just did not work for me. So I found I was not returning to the memos as often as I should, or at the points I was writing them and leaving them. But what the light bulb moment for me was that basically it was to turn the memos themselves into a story and a timeline. And that by doing that, I could actually map in a literal timeline how my thinking evolved and what that meant to be. So again, this is what makes the theory grounded, is being theoretically sensitive to the issues that arise, and doing this at all stages of the research. And of course then you come on to doing the exact same with the literature that you've chosen to sample based on the emergent themes, but also then in this instance looking at the local authority documentation on fictitious inquiry. Of course that would also have an influence and be guiding or potentially guiding what the local authority would like the NQTs to be thinking about the inquiry. And that is chapter 2. Thank you.